She's built and publicly released 5 WordPress themes with a 6th on its way. This one coming up is a WP API powered JavaScript theme that aims to be accessibility ready. She's an automatician that lives here in Boston, and please join me in welcoming Kelly Dwan.
Have to get everything set up first. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks for the intro, Jordan. We all know who I am now, so let's just get started. So I think React is a pretty cool technology, and today I just wanted to give you an overview and then dive into how to use React with, how to use React with WordPress. So React is a JavaScript library for building interfaces. It was developed by Facebook and open sourced in 2013. It really picked up traction in the last few years, rapidly becoming the hot thing, and now pretty commonly used, and for good reason. React makes it easy to render interactive content onto a page. React makes it easy to render interactive content onto a page without a lot of overhead and re-rendering. This is great whether your app or website is something the user interacts with, or if it's rapidly being updated by the API. So here's the traditional to-do MVC example. In an app like this, the user can interact with it in a variety of ways, like entering to-dos, crossing off to-dos, displaying only active or completed tasks, and deleting to-dos from the list. This is all done very quickly because React handles this kind of rendering of content very well. So let's take a step back for a second. The DOM, or Document Object Model, is how the browser interprets your HTML to create the page you see. This is what you interact with when you're writing JavaScript. When you replace text on a page, you're manipulating the DOM, not writing directly to HTML. Anyway, I mentioned that React handles rendering changes very well. Rather than re-rendering the entire app with each change, React keeps track of your app in something called a virtual DOM, its own representation of the page. The virtual DOM and the browser's DOM are compared, and then only the changes are re-rendered. So each React application can be broken down into components. In the to-do example, there's a component for the app container, to-do app, a component for each task, the to-do item, and one for the footer actions, to-do footer. Each of these contain the functionality they use. For example, the to-do item handles the edit functionality. They also keep track of their own properties and state, and I'll get into that next. So this is what React JavaScript code looks like. If you haven't seen React before, maybe it seems strange. This new syntax is called JSX, which gives you the ability to write HTML-like code in your JavaScript. This is then compiled down to plain JavaScript, which is what's sent to your browser. It's kind of like Sass for CSS. You can create components by using the create class function, or by using ES6 classes. Here, hello is a component that renders a div that says hello. You tell a component what to render by defining a render method inside the class. Now you render your component into a container element that's already on the page. Here we add it to the element with ID container. You can also nest components if you wanted to add something else into hello, create another component just like this, and use the HTML-like JSX syntax to add it into hello's render value. I haven't mentioned the hello name part yet. Components also keep track of their properties, or props. These are values that are passed into the component when it's called. For example, here, hello is passed the prop name equals world. Inside the component, this is accessed in this.props. You can render out variables in components with the curly braces, much like some other JavaScript templating languages. And you can see if I change the name prop to Sarah, the rendered div will say hello Sarah. You can open up this CodePen yourself by going to that URL, and from there you can play around with some basic React. So components are built to be reusable, so you can just pass in different props to display different information. This is sounding a bit like templates in WordPress. Since you can reuse components, you might also want to make sure the props you're accepting are what you want them to be. React lets you set up prop types in the component class, and each new prop set will be validated against these before rendering. Here are a few example prop types. We'll check that is enabled as a Boolean, count as a number, title as a string. We also want to make sure we always have title so we can flag it as required. If this fails, you'll see a warning in the console. There are more prop types for objects, arrays, elements. You can also say that a thing can be a string or a number, and so on. These are built in from React, so check the docs for the full list. Also, this will only happen in development, so you don't have these console errors in production. So in addition to props, components can also keep track of state. This is what it sounds like. It's the current state of your app. For the to-do app, the state keeps track of which tasks are shown. The component can update its own state with this.setState, letting it be controlled with user events like a button click. You can set up an initial state for the first time your component renders. Changing the state causes the component to re-render, so you get that live update feeling automatically. Other methods you can use in a React component are related to the life cycle of the component. For example, component will mount happens after the component is initialized, but before the component is rendered. Component did mount happens after render, so you can put code here that relies on having a rendered component. These are very similar to hooks in WordPress. Should component update lets you check the props and state of an update to see if the component really needs to re-render. This can be useful if you're trying to cut down on how often a page renders. Component did update only runs on updates, not the initial mount, but can also be used to trigger any repeated actions. There are more methods like this, and if you're interested, you should check out the documentation for the rest. So the React community is very standards focused, especially compared to what can feel like the Wild West of WordPress. There are a handful of gotchas though. So JSX itself is strict, and it's not HTML, even though it looks like HTML. If you're familiar with XML, it's actually closer than that. And when you're writing JSX, even with HTML elements, it isn't. There will be some attributes with different names, like class isn't class, it's class name, since class is a special word in JavaScript. This is another thing where you're better off looking at the documentation when you're starting out, so you know what to expect. So even though it's usually talked about as if it were the whole JavaScript stack, React itself is just for the interface. It's just what renders your content onto the page. But the community has decided that some things play better than others, so you'll see a lot of the same technology in articles and tutorials. Here's a quick overview of some of those things and what they're used for. So since React uses the JSX syntax, not straight JavaScript, you'll need something to compile it. That's where Webpack comes in. WordPress developers are probably familiar with Gulp or Grunt for compiling Sass. Webpack is similar to those, where you can set up plugins to compile JSX to JavaScript. This takes all your code that you've broken out into separate files and packages it into one bundle as well. You can run Webpack through Grunt or Gulp, or you can run it directly. I'm not going to talk about setting it up. There are plenty of tutorials online for so many different ways of setting it up. So Babel is a JavaScript compiler, and it usually works through Webpack, though again, you can run it directly. This allows you to use future JavaScript language constructs, and Babel will compile it into browser-friendly code. Like Webpack, you add plugins that enable your preferred language features, and then you can use these in your code without worrying about browser support. This tool is like Less or Post CSS with an auto-prefixer that let all of us developers use CSS3 before those properties had wider browser support. The newer JavaScript syntax will probably be confusing when you're starting out, if you're used to JavaScript from a few years ago maybe, as some tutorials have picked up on it while others haven't. You can also check out the Babel website to learn more about the language stages. NPM is a package manager for JavaScript. You'll use this to find and install small packages, bits of functionality that you'll use in your application. You're probably familiar with NPM from Grunt or Gulp, but here you're importing the code directly into your application where you can use it, and it really saves you time from writing out like redundant functions. Yeah. So, in an overly simplistic description, Flux is a standard for managing data in an application. In Flux, you have actions that update data and stores that hold the data. The components listen for events dispatched by the actions and render with the data in the updated store. On screen is a graph from Facebook illustrating this flow. Your view, or maybe an API response, will trigger an action. The dispatcher handles sending those to the store, and then the store updates its data in response. Once the store is changed, the view updates with the new data. So in an overly simplistic description, Redux is a standard for managing data in an application. I think I just said that. So Redux is a different approach to data. There are some similar ideas. That actions should trigger events, and that components listen for those changes. But in Redux, we keep track of everything about the application in one object called the state. There are a few other Redux-specific things you'll run into, so here are some keywords. State, this is all the data in your app, including UI state, like what the page the user is seeing. So this is just an object, for example, a collection of posts, but the view, React for us, uses this to render the app. Actions are the actions that run in your site, for example, loading posts from an API. Reducers use the state and action data to produce the next step of state. For example, when your load post action runs, a reducer would take the new post data and put it into your app's state. The components are listening to the state and would re-render when the state updates. Reducers are meant to be pure functions. They only use the state and action data, and the returned state should always be predictable. This makes them very easy to test, which is another benefit of Redux. So the reducers return the new state, and React can re-render with the updated data. Another commonly used pattern is to use selectors to get data from the state. With the state holding all of the data involved in your app, it can become a large nested object tree. Selectors are used to help keep your app organized. Redux is pretty much the current best practice for data. The docs are very detailed with plenty of examples to get you started. Also, egghead.io has a great video tutorial by the creator of this pattern, which in addition to showing you how to use all of this, also shows you how it evolved. So in WordPress, we tend not to think about routing, since permalinks take care of that for us. A route is a URL which shows specific content, like page versus an archive. In JavaScript, we can use something like page.js to run functions based on the current URL, or React Router to render components based on the URL. So Node is probably the most intimidating aspect to a WordPress developer. We'd prefer to think of it as a black box, using it without really understanding it. Node is a JavaScript engine, a program that runs whatever JavaScript you give it. This can be anything from a simple command line script to a server rendering your React app. If you want to use React's server-side rendering, you'll need to power it with a Node server. Services like Heroku are used to quickly get a server running and usually have good tutorials. So given all those various tools I've just mentioned, it can be very hard to get started. Luckily, the React developers gave us Create React App, which is a command line tool used to start up a new project. Once installed, it creates apps with basic project structure and pre-installed scripts to run a server to display your app, test your code, or build your project to deploy it. It's a very simple setup, but you can easily add any packages you need to your project, and if something feels too limiting, you can eject from Create React App to take back full control of your project. To bring it back to WordPress, this is sort of a cross between VVV and underscores. It sets up the Node server for you and gives you a project scaffold to work from. So now what all of you care about. How do you use React with WordPress? Well, however you want. It's a library like jQuery. You can use it for small things, or you can rebuild your website with it. You don't need to jump straight to an entire web app, although you can. You could build an app that pulls data from WordPress using the REST API. But you don't need to be using the WordPress API to use React. Maybe you're pulling data from a third-party API. Or you're making an admin UI, maybe you just want to use it for some interactive components. But most likely, if you're working with WordPress in React, you probably want an API, and it does make sense to take advantage of the one that's already here. However, you're not required to use React if you want to use the API. React is a great way to interact with API data, But just because these two seem to hit the WordPress scene together doesn't mean they're related. You can use the REST API with jQuery, vanilla JavaScript, another JavaScript framework. We just heard all about Backbone. And if you're JavaScript averse, you can also use it from any other language, PHP, Ruby, etc. But we're at a WordPress conference, and this is a React talk, so let's talk about that. Who is doing what with React? So first, a handful of plugins have started using React and WP Admin. Jetpack, everyone's favorite plugin, launched a new admin UI. A few months ago. This converts dashboard and module settings to a JavaScript-driven interface. I asked some of the developers who were more involved in the project what they thought about the process. First, they said a benefit was speed. Users don't need to wait for page refreshes as they navigate through our dashboard, and saving settings is also much faster. Switching to React also improves the developer experience. React has a strong community investment in testing and code limping, so it's easy to bring those in when starting a new project, whereas for longer running PHP projects, maybe that wasn't a priority at start. So the new UI is easier to write because issues are caught beforehand by ESLint or tests. We've also set up continuous integration tests that run on each pull request, so that even if a developer forgets to run the test locally, it won't be merged with a failing test. Similarly, by moving to Redux, we've reduced the strange edge case bugs. The three principles of Redux are that the state is the single source of truth, the state is read-only, and that changes are made with pure functions. Well, how does that help? The state determines the UI, and the only thing that can change the state are actions. Nothing else can touch it. The fact that reducers are pure functions mean that any change made by any action should be reproducible, given the same state. So there should be no more side effect bugs, like something only happens when you clicked this button first. One of the hard things the developers encountered was how to manage data. First, they had to write new API endpoints to manage the module status and settings, which turned out to be a good exercise. Now that we have those, any future development will be easier. But using the data in the dashboard was difficult before they landed on using Redux everywhere. They wanted to preload some data when the page was first loaded, so you could interact with the data with the dashboard before waiting on an API response. What they noticed was that some developers were accessing the initial data even after the app was rendered, which led to sometimes using stale data. Moving to Redux helped this. Now developers only worried about what the state was, rather than thinking about where to get the data from, and the fetching of data was offloaded to the actions. Any other data management system would have also solved this, but making sure to have something from the start would have prevented this kind of mix-up. So this is Foxhound. It's a fully React-based theme I've been working on. It's in the review queue right now, and so hopefully it'll be available on WordPress.org soon. There's been a lot of focus on slick custom apps for specific niches, but I wanted to make something that would be blogging focused. I really wanted something that would have a wider audience to show that the REST API and JavaScript themes don't have to be the realm of only the top agencies. So you can download this, install it like any other theme, and now your site is technically a single-page app. And you get all the speed benefits of that. So that was my goal here. Of course, along the way, I hit some roadblocks. Maybe you don't think about everything WordPress does for you in classic themes. For example, how many of you know what this is? Yeah, okay, that got laughs. So you probably know their rewrite rules. This tells WordPress what page to show when a person lands on any given path. The core software builds this up for us, so you don't need to worry about telling WordPress that you want an archive page for your new post type. Register post type handles that. Likewise, WordPress uses these rewrite rules to determine the current query for getting data from the database and to determine what template to show. However, if you're not hitting WordPress for each page, which you aren't in a single page app, you need to handle this yourself. On screen is how it's done in Foxhound. I'm using React Router, which lets you define paths and which components should be rendered when the path is matched. You can see there are routes for pages, posts, and all the different archives: category, tag, data, date, author, and I had to define all of these. So for example, they're defined as category/:slug. The colon indicates that part of the path is a parameter, and we can use that in the component. term in this case. And we need that information because we also have to handle fetching data from the API. So because this is a repetitive task across projects, I created some components and Redux helpers. This handles the API request and sets up the Redux state structure. These packages are on NPM, so you can use them in your projects too. There are examples of how to use them on each component's page, and I've created them for posts, pages, comments, users, media, and menus. So there's one for each, and you can just pull whatever you want. So there's another gotcha here too. Child themes just won't work. At least not the template inheritance part of child theming. Core only looks for PHP files when checking for child templates. It won't understand your JavaScript components. Maybe as we move towards more JavaScript in core, we might move to something that would allow for this. That would be pretty cool. But it would probably be a separate new theming system. So React is also good for custom client sites. For example, WAMU's site was built by 10up and uses React to take advantage of the lack of page reloads to allow their media player to continue uninterrupted during page navigations. Here's an example of only part of a site using React. All WordCamp sites have access to a plugin called Taggregator, which pulls posts from different social media networks that use a specific tag. It's shown here on the WordCamp US site for posts tag WCUS. The main section there is React, pulling in the imported posts and live reloading any new feature or any new content that's added. This was rewritten about a year ago to use the REST API, and we went with React so that the live update feature would be less of a performance drain. It was pretty straightforward and is the kind of thing React is made for, so this went very well. Another example of using React for an agency's website is the S2 website, which they collaborated with HumanMade for. This one isn't a React theme, instead it's a Node app. Rather than a site served by WordPress with PHP rendering the page first, it's served by Node, building the page from the same code that then takes over client-side to give that fast, interactive app feel. Meanwhile, there's still WordPress involved for the data. Going the app route is a little more complicated. So this diagram was put together to show the architecture of the site, and you can see there are two server setups involved, the darker gray boxes. The backend server is a traditional WordPress setup. It's where the site authors go to manage content, but the front end is not served there. All this WordPress does is serve an API. On the right side is another setup, the Node server, which runs the same JavaScript as the client and pre-renders the page, just like WordPress would do. The benefit here is you're only writing JavaScript, and thanks to Node, the server can understand that and render a complete page. In the previous examples, we were using a PHP server to render a container, and waiting on the JavaScript client to load before we can render content. So where do I see all this going? Well, one of my colleagues thinks that as JavaScript progresses, the language will become more robust. At the same time, browsers will get faster and more performant. So we're going to see even more apps written this way, and I think I agree. How about in WordPress specifically? So in general, I think the REST API will lead to a lot of non-PHP development. That might be React and JavaScript, or other languages, from the Internet of Things to machine learning source text. I think we'll see a lot more out-of-the-box uses as the WordPress API, as the API gains grounds. So design is ever more important. Those out-of-the-box apps will have new interactions and design patterns that don't exist in core yet. So you can't just rely on existing styles. If you're not a designer, find one. They're all excited about the cool things we can do too. One tip though, make sure you're thinking about how people will use your app and not just throwing in cool transitions because JavaScript. So I think everyone agrees that we shouldn't be making apps that people can't use. But sometimes people think JavaScript is inherently inaccessible, and therefore they don't need to deal with it. However, not only does accessibility mean more than screen readers, users with screen readers do have JavaScript enabled. So you do need to pay attention to it. However, this is a big topic, and I'm not going to get into any specifics. I would recommend WebAIM, webaim.org, for everything from an intro to accessibility to specific considerations with JavaScript and web apps. I'm also happy to talk about this in person if anyone wants to find me later. So I mentioned server-side rendering of JavaScript when I was talking about the S2 website. This means that you write JavaScript once and can run it both on the client and server side using Node. React makes this easy, although there are some setup differences. But the components you write are shared across both. So why should you do server-side rendering? Well, it can give you better load time, since the page isn't empty while you're waiting for all the JavaScript to load. The app can finish loading. And then the client-side JavaScript can take over. If there is a user with JavaScript disabled, for some reason, you can let the server rendering take over, and then they'll have a normal web browsing experience. It should also give you better SEO. I don't really pay attention to that, but Google says it will crawl your JavaScript app, and I'm not sure about other search engines. So, pretty sure everyone knows that Calypso is what the new WordPress.com UI is called. Matt Mullenweg announced during the State of the Word last year that we're working on adding extensions to Calypso. Basically, this will be a system where you can add your own code to Calypso for your WordPress plugin. So this would add a section to WordPress.com where your users could do whatever you want them to. Manage your plugins, see a new dashboard, and so on. This is still an ongoing project. If you're interested, I have a short link to the documentation on screen. And it's very early, I think, in the existence of this project. So anyway, so that's what I have to say on React and WordPress. I hope if you're not already playing with it, you'll give it a try. If you do, you might find you soon have a problem of overreacting. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kelly. Are there any questions?
So my question is, in the case of the URL routing, in the event that a URL is landed on that maybe you didn't take into account, is the PHP rendered in that case, or would you just arrive at a 404 through the React router?
So the question is about routing and a URL that I didn't account for. But I actually do account for everything. If you look at the last line, I don't know how well you can see that. It's like a path equals asterisk. And so you just go to a general not found 404 page.
Okay, thank you.
There you are.
When will that be available?
What? Sorry.
When will that theme be available, do you think?
It's on GitHub right now, so you could go look at it. I've been doing it for like a year now. I'm hoping that this last round of feedback will be the last bit that I have to fix, but turns out accessibility is hard when it's not easy to test with screen readers so much. But I mean, that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. I don't want to make it sound like it's impossible.
Are there any particular accessibility issues that were challenging when building out your theme?
So the big problem with JavaScript theme, JavaScript anything, is that you need to tell the screen reader that the page is changing. So if you don't have like these specific tags, they're called ARIA tags, then it doesn't know, the screen reader doesn't know to pay attention to a section of the website and see that it's updating. If you don't include those, the screen reader isn't told that things have changed. So if you're using a screen reader, it's like the page never changes.
You touched on this a little bit in the first half of your talk, but are there any other resources you'd recommend for learning React and Redux and getting started?
I watched a lot of the Egghead videos. I don't know, I kind of just dove into it working with, working at Automatic, we were using it. I don't know that I have anything off the top of my head. I actually have no idea where I'm speaking to, so this is really weird. Oh, you're there.
Sorry.
Okay, any further questions? All right, thank you very much, Kelly.
Okay, thank you.